9 hikers cut their own tent open from the inside and ran into -30-degree snow, half-dressed, some barefoot, away from nothing anyone has ever been able to identify. 6 to 5 years later, their case file is still stamped unsolved. That's just one of 10 deaths on this list that official science still can't explain. Number 10 will make you check your own hotel room tonight. This video covers 10 real, documented deaths, spanning 1828 to 2013, where the official record ends not with an answer, but with a shrug. Detectives, coroners, and in some cases entire governments looked at the same evidence you're about to see and simply could not close the file. We're counting up from strange to genuinely unexplainable. So if case 1 feels merely creepy, wait for case 10. Let's start fast, with 3 cases stacked back to back. Case 1. Thelma Todd, a bright, successful 1930s comedy actress, was found dead in her car in her own garage in December 1935, slumped over the wheel, dressed in an evening gown from a party the night before. Officially, carbon monoxide poisoning, ruled accidental. Unofficially, her body had injuries inconsistent with a simple accident. Her home had signs of a struggle, and she'd reportedly been receiving threats tied to organized crime figures pressuring her to let them run a casino out of her restaurant. No one was ever charged. Case 2, actor Bob Crane, star of Hogan's Heroes, was found bludgeoned to death in his Scottsdale apartment in June 1978. Police had a single strong suspect, a friend and video equipment dealer named John Carpenter, tied to Crane's secret hobby of secretly filming himself with women. Carpenter was tried in 1994, 16 years later, and acquitted. The case remains officially open to this day. Case 3, actress Natalie Wood drowned off Catalina Island in November 1981, during a boozy yacht trip with her husband Robert Wagner and actor Christopher Walken. The death certificate was quietly changed in 2012, decades later, from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors, after new bruising evidence surfaced. Wagner remains, to this day, officially named a person of interest. 3 different decades. 3 different causes. 1 identical pattern. Money, fame, and a death certificate nobody fully believes. Now here's the case with the strangest physical evidence of anything on this list. In late January 1959, 9 experienced Russian hikers, students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, set out on a skiing expedition through the northern Ural Mountains, aiming for a peak the local Monsey people called Dead Mountain. They never returned. When a search party finally found their camp 3 weeks later, the tent was found cut open from the inside, not the outside, meaning something inside the tent made them slash their own shelter to escape, rather than simply walk out the door. Footprints in the snow showed the group fleeing barefoot or in socks, away from the tent, into forest more than a mile away, in temperatures around -25 to -30 degrees Celsius. Investigators found the first 2 bodies under a cedar tree, appearing to have died of hypothermia after apparently trying to climb the tree. Bark was scraped and broken up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed it to look back at something. 3 more bodies were found between the tree and the tent, seemingly having tried to return for warmer clothing and died along the way. But that wasn't even the strangest part. The final 4 bodies weren't found until May, buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine, and these 4 had catastrophic injuries. 1 woman was missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her lips. 2 of the men had fatal chest fractures with the force investigators compared to a car crash, and yet no external bruising or skin damage at all, as if crushed from the inside without impact. The original Soviet investigation was abruptly closed in 1959. Its official cause listed only as a compelling unknown force. Explanations proposed since have ranged from a secret weapons test, to an avalanche, to katabatic winds, to infrasound-induced panic, and in 2019, Russian authorities officially reopened the case, then closed it again in 2020, citing an avalanche theory that many independent forensic experts still consider unconvincing given the tongue and eyes were never found and never fully explained. Quick recap and bridge. 3 unsolved Hollywood deaths, and now 9 trained mountaineers who ran to their deaths from something still unnamed. But those were open-air mysteries. The next 2 cases happened behind closed doors, in homes that stayed eerily undisturbed for days after the killer walked out. In the tiny Bavarian hamlet of Hinterkaifeck, Germany, in March 1922, farmer Andreas Gruber, His wife, their adult daughter, her 2 children, and the family's new maid were all killed with a mattock, a farming pickaxe, in or near the barn, over what investigators believe was more than one night. Weeks before the murders, Andreas had reported strange footprints in the snow leading toward the house but not away from it, as well as the sound of footsteps in the attic and a newspaper that mysteriously appeared on the property that nobody in the household recognized or had bought. He dismissed it and told no one else. Here's the detail that still unsettles investigators a century later. Forensic evidence showed the killer stayed on the farm for several days after the murders, feeding the livestock, since neighbors reported the animals were calm and cared for, and even reportedly having meals in the kitchen, since food had clearly been prepared and eaten after the estimated time of death. Smoke was seen from the chimney for days after the family had already been killed. More than 100 suspects were investigated over the following century, including the victim's own son-in-law, a former fiancé of the daughter believed to be dead in World War I, and various local men. Despite modern forensic reviews as recently as the 2000s using updated techniques, the case remains completely unsolved, and the murder weapon itself has been lost. Villisca, Iowa, June 1912. Sometime after midnight, someone entered the Moore family farmhouse and killed all 6 family members. Parents Josiah and Sarah Moore and their 4 children, plus 2 young houseguests staying the night, all with an axe belonging to Josiah himself, left behind at the scene. The killer covered every mirror in the house with cloth and clothing, and covered the victims' faces after death, a detail investigators still can't explain, since it fits no known ritual or motive on record. A plate of uneaten food was found in the kitchen, suggesting the killer stayed in the house for some time after the murders, mirroring the same disturbing pattern seen a decade later at Hinterkaifeck, an ocean away. Investigators pursued a traveling minister, a state senator, and a serial axe murder theory linking Villisca to a string of similar unsolved axe killings across the Midwest and South between 1911 and 1912, all involving families, all at night, all with the family's own axe. No one was ever convicted. The house still stands today, preserved as a museum, and to this day nobody has ever been able to explain why the mirrors were covered. Quick recap and bridge: 2 farmhouse massacres, a century and an ocean apart, both left behind by killers who lingered, ate, and vanished without a trace or a motive. The next case trades the farmhouse for a frozen fjord, and introduces a woman authorities never identified at all, not even after they exhumed and re-examined her body decades later. In November 1970, hikers in Isdalen, literally, Ice Valley, outside Bergen, Norway, found a burned, unidentifiable female body among rocks, surrounded by an altered passport, a partially destroyed umbrella, jewelry with serial numbers filed off, and rubber boots. An autopsy found sleeping pills in her system alongside the burns, and her fingertips had been deliberately burned off before death, apparently to prevent identification. When police searched a train station locker connected to her, they found suitcases containing multiple wigs, several sets of clothing tags with labels removed, and at least 8 different aliases she'd been traveling under across Europe in the months before her death. Fenella Lork, Claudia Tielt, Vera Jal, among others, each identity supported with a passport that, on inspection, appeared to be a genuine but fraudulently obtained document, the kind investigators associated at the time with intelligence agency tradecraft. Witnesses who'd interacted with the Isdal woman in hotels described her as fluent in at least 5 languages, and hotel staff recalled her requesting rooms be changed multiple times, always away from windows facing the street. A partial fingerprint recovered decades later, alongside modern isotope analysis of her teeth in 2016, suggested she was likely of Central European origin and had lived in France as a child, but as of the video's release, her true identity has still never been confirmed, and Norwegian police have never ruled out an intelligence connection. In February 1957, a young boy, roughly 4 to 6 years old, was found dead in a cardboard box in the woods outside Philadelphia. He'd been beaten, his body carefully washed after death, his hair recently and unevenly cut, as if someone who knew him had tried, almost tenderly, to clean him up before abandoning him. Investigators printed his photograph on over 400,000 flyers, distributed them inside gas bills across the city, consulted a psychic on live television, and even exhumed and re-examined his body in 1998 hoping new forensic techniques would help. Genetic genealogy testing as recently as 2022 has narrowed his likely family background, but as of this video, America's unknown child, as is known in every case file, has still never been identified, and no one has ever been charged with his death. Quick bridge. Notice the shift happening across these last two cases. We've moved from murders with too many suspects to victims police can't even name. The next case flips that completely. A boy whose entire identity, appearance, and even accent were a documented mystery while he was still alive. In May 1828, a teenager appeared in the streets of Nuremberg, Germany, barely able to speak, carrying only a letter addressed to a cavalry captain. He gave his name as Caspar Hauser and claimed he'd spent his entire life alone in a darkened cell, fed only bread and water by an unseen hand, with no memory of ever seeing another human being before that day. He became a minor celebrity, studied by philosophers and scientists fascinated by what a genuinely isolated human mind looked like. Then, in October 1829, he was found with a stab wound, claiming an unknown attacker had cornered him in a cellar. He recovered. In 1833, he was fatally stabbed in a public park, again claiming a stranger had lured him there with a promise of information about his true parentage, dying days later from the wound. To this day, historians remain split on whether Caspar Hauser was the hidden, disinherited heir to the House of Baden, silenced to protect a royal succession, or an elaborate fraud who staged his own death. DNA testing conducted on preserved blood samples in the 1990s and 2000s produced genuinely conflicting, inconclusive results between different labs, and his true identity remains formally unresolved. In late September 1849, Edgar Allan Poe, the man who essentially invented the modern detective story and the psychological horror tale, vanished for nearly a week in Baltimore. He was found delirious, in someone else's clothes, outside a tavern that doubled as a polling location during local elections, repeatedly calling out a name, Reynolds, that no one has ever definitively connected to any person in his life. He died 4 days later in a hospital, without ever regaining enough clarity to explain what had happened to him. His original medical records and death certificate have been lost to history entirely, and the attending physician's notes describing his condition were destroyed in a fire decades later. Theories proposed since include rabies, carbon monoxide poisoning, alcohol withdrawal, and, the one that's gained the most traction among modern researchers, cooping, a 19th-century election fraud practice where gangs kidnapped men, drugged or beat them, and forced them to vote multiple times under different disguises at different polling stations, which would explain both his location outside a polling place and his unfamiliar clothing. No cause of death has ever been officially and conclusively confirmed. In January 2013, guests at Los Angeles' Cecil Hotel, a building already linked to 2 separate serial killers who'd stayed there decades earlier, began complaining about low water pressure and a strange taste in the tap water. Staff eventually climbed onto the roof and looked inside the hotel's rooftop water cistern. Inside was the body of 21-year-old Canadian tourist Eliza Lamb, who had been missing for nearly 3 weeks. Before her disappearance, the hotel's elevator security camera had captured her behaving erratically, pressing multiple floor buttons repeatedly, stepping in and out of the elevator, hiding around the corner of the frame, and making unusual hand gestures towards someone or something unseen outside the frame, all while the elevator doors stayed open far longer than mechanically normal. That footage was released publicly by police trying to identify her, and it went viral worldwide, spawning years of amateur theories. The official cause of death was ultimately ruled as accidental drowning, complicated by bipolar disorder she was being treated for, and toxicology confirmed she hadn't taken her prescribed medication in the days before her death, which experts say can trigger exactly the kind of confused, erratic behavior seen on camera. But 2 specific details remain formally unresolved even in the official report. How her body ended up inside a heavy water tank on the roof that required real physical effort and a ladder to access from a normally alarmed, staff-only door, and why, on close analysis, the elevator's call panel showed no actual mechanical malfunction during the exact window she appeared to be pressing buttons with no visible effect. On December 1, 1948, a well-dressed man was found dead, sitting upright against a sea-wall on Somerton Beach in Adelaide, Australia. No identification, no wallet, all clothing labels carefully removed, and an unlit cigarette resting on his collar as if it had simply rolled off his lips. The autopsy found no clear cause of death, no signs of external violence, and results consistent with poisoning that the coroner could never definitively identify or name. Months later, investigators discovered a tiny hidden pocket sewn inside the waistband of his trousers. A pocket not original to the garment, custom added, containing a single torn scrap of paper printed with 2 Persian words, tamam shud, meaning it is ended or finished, torn from the final page of a rare edition of a 12th century Persian poetry collection. Police tracked down the exact copy of that book, discarded in the back seat of an unlocked car nearby, containing a phone number for a local nurse and a mysterious block of 5 lines of capital letters, believed to be some form of cipher or code, that professional cryptographers, code breakers, and amateur enthusiasts have spent more than 70 years failing to definitively crack. For 7 decades, the man was known only as the Somerton Man. Then, in July 2022, using DNA extracted from hairs trapped in an old plaster cast of his face and advanced genetic genealogy, the same forensic technique used to catch the Golden State Killer, Australian researchers announced a likely identification: Carl Charles Webb, a Melbourne-born electrical engineer born in 1905. It was hailed globally as the case finally being solved. But here's what almost nobody reported in the headlines. Even with a name attached, investigators still cannot explain why he traveled to Adelaide, why every clothing label had been meticulously removed, who the nurse connected to the phone number really was to him, what poison actually killed him, or what those 5 lines of code actually say. 74 years later, the man finally has a name, and the mystery, somehow, remains just as unsolved as the day they found him. Every case on this list has one thing in common: enough evidence to make you think an answer is close, and never quite enough to actually close the book. Sometimes science catches up: a name, a DNA match, a partial theory, and the mystery survives anyway, which might be the most unsettling truth of all. Some deaths simply aren't built to be solved. If the fact that the Somerton Man's cipher is still uncracked after 74 years got under your skin, you need to see our full breakdown of history's most famous unsolved codes. Drop a comment. Which of these 10 cases do you think will finally get solved first? See you in the next one.